Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Howe, and we're here at the Churchyard Cemetery in Hollis Center, Hollis, New Hampshire. I would like to introduce you to my relatives.
Don't say mine. Honey Glover.
I'm Miriam Glover Starrett, and I live in Lunenburg, Massachusetts.
I'm Laurel Howe. I live in Idaho.
We're all cousins, descendants of some of the earlier settlers in Hollis. And the reason we're here today is another of our cousins, John P. Howe III, asked me if I would be interested in doing a video project of our Hollis ancestors at various cemeteries in Hollis, because a lot of our family members now live away from town and they're not as familiar with who is buried where. And so he said, do you think you could arrange for a video and we could circulate it to all our cousins and relatives around the country, and it would be really great for them to have an idea of our family history in this town. So here we are at the grave sites of the earliest Howes that I'm aware of that moved to Hollis and are buried here in the Churchyard Cemetery. So a little background, we're not directly descended from these people, but I'll give you a little background because we are connected. There was a Joseph Howe who was born in 1719, and he married a Sarah Sheldon of Salem, Massachusetts, and they had 9 children, including 3 boys: Ephraim Howe, who was born in 1753, Joseph, who was born in 1754, and John, who was born in 1755. And by 1775, the time of the Revolution, Ephraim and Joseph were both taxpayers on the rolls in Hollis, New Hampshire. All 3 of these brothers served in the Revolution. And Ephraim, whose gravestone is in the center, was a third cousin to Nathaniel Howe, who is our ancestor, and this is Old Nathaniel. There were 3 Nathaniels: Old Nathaniel, Old Nathaniel, and Young Nathaniel. So I'm going to refer to them like that. So Ephraim was a third cousin to the middle Nathaniel, Old Nathaniel. And he and his wife Mehitabel are buried here in the Churchyard Cemetery. And the reason I found out about Ephraim was the DAR did a book of old Hollis homesteads, and they researched a lot of the houses in Hollis, and they went back through the deeds and found who was living in these old houses. And as I was reading that compilation of information one day at the Historical Society, I noticed Ephraim Howe's name, and I thought, there has to be a reason, there has to be a connection, really, between Ephraim and our Nathaniel. And it turns out that Ephraim was living in an old house down near the Nashua River in the area of where Powers Road is now and Snow Lane. And Ephraim and his family apparently moved away, and then our Nathaniel, Old Nathaniel, came and moved into that same house, according to the DAR book. So I figured there was a relationship there somehow, and then when I got a hold of the Daniel Waite Howe genealogy volumes, 2 volumes books, I realized and found confirmation that Ephraim was indeed related to Nathaniel. So anyway, that old house is no longer standing. It's been gone a long time. But after our Nathaniel, Old Nathaniel, moved there and married Elmira Rideout, they had a troubled marriage, I believe, and Elmira ended up moving into the old Howe house at the end of Snow Lane, which most of us have visited at one time or another in our lives. And that house, within the last few years, was purchased for a subdivision development, and that house was also demolished not too many years ago. So those houses are gone, but at least we know a little bit more about the Howes and how they arrived in Hollis. One more connection I'd like to make is the first minister that came to Hollis was Reverend Daniel Emerson. And he came here in 1743 And I think he was here his entire life until he died when he was well into his 80s, I think, about that. I didn't look him up. But he is buried right behind the church here. You can read his gravestone and the information on it about him. Well, our old Nathaniel is buried here. But old Nathaniel had a father who was the old Nathaniel. And he was from Topsfield. And he was married to Hannah Emerson. So when I found that out, I thought, well, that's probably how they got to Hollis, was Hannah was related to Daniel Emerson, our first minister. And there's another connection there. So Hannah was a cousin once removed from Daniel Emerson, and she married old Nathaniel. This taller one, the older one, is his wife Mary, and the shorter one on the left is Joseph, his brother. And I put the flags here at Memorial Day this year because the graves seemed kind of abandoned. No one was paying attention to them, and they both were soldiers in the Revolution, so I put flags there this year in honor of that. Carol, you know more than I do. You should be talking.
No, you're doing great.
So here we are over at Nathaniel and Mehitable's graves in the Churchyard Cemetery in Hollis. As I spoke previously, old Nathaniel from Ipswich, Massachusetts, was married to Hannah Emerson. And they had 4 children, Nathaniel, Aaron, Hannah, and Mark. Nathaniel is the one that's buried right here. He was born February 19th, 1766, and he died January 12th, 1840. He was married to Mehitable Green. She was born in 1771, and she died January 12th, 1847. So they moved to Hollis, and they moved into Ephraim's house, and they didn't have any children. But Mehitable's sister, Sally, was married to William Fetty Place of Marblehead, Massachusetts. And he was a mariner, and he lost his life at sea, and his oldest son, Nathaniel, was fatherless at a very young age, about 5 years old, and he was sent to Hollis to live with his mother's sister, Mehitable, and her husband, Nathaniel Howe. And he was actually named after his uncle. So his name was Nathaniel Howe Fetty Place, and he was adopted Howe. So his name ended up being Nathaniel Howe Fetty Place Howe, named after his uncle, Nathaniel Howe. We are back at the Pine Hill Cemetery, which is where several generations of our family have lived in Pine Hill. In fact, 7 generations, I think, now. We'll have to count those up. But I want to connect into the ancestors that are buried here. I'd like to connect them into the Powers family and the Rideout family. And to start, Peter Powers was the first settler. He and his wife, Anna Keyes, were the first settlers of Hollis, before it was known as Hollis, the parish of West Dunstable at the time. They came here in 1731 and built their homestead up near the center of Hollis. And Peter Powers had quite a remarkable and interesting career. There's a book written about him, Peter Powers Pioneer, that was written in about 1930 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the town of Hollis. It talks a lot about Peter, his wife Anna, and their 13 children. And we believe that our ancestor, Jonathan Powers, is related to Peter Powers. But we don't know which Jonathan we're talking about. There are as many as 7 Jonathans that I have heard of that are sort of all alive in the same century. So, but I think the Jonathan that we're related to was married 2 or 3 times to, or 4, to Bridget, a woman named Bridget. We don't have a last name. So the reason I'm standing here beside this little gravestone is because this is Bridget Powers, a headstone for Bridget Powers. So she may be a relative of ours. And then next to her, our Jonathan, whichever Jonathan he was also married to Susanna Willoughby. And the next stone has the names of 3 of the children of Jonathan Powers and Susanna Willoughby, who died young: Hannah, Noah, and Mahitable. So one of the daughters of Jonathan and Susanna was Rebecca Powers. And I have an interesting story about Rebecca. Some of you may know that my husband and I acquired and restored the Pine Hill Schoolhouse in Hollis, New Hampshire, in the Pine Hill section. And when we dismantled the schoolhouse to repair it and restore it, we were moving some debris from around the building. And my husband pushed some logs aside, and the forks on his tractor scraped over a gravestone. And we looked down, and here was this stone lying on the ground underneath all these pine logs. It was upside down, and he turned it over, and it was a gravestone for Rebecca. Rebecca, the wife of Jonathan Rideout. Rebecca Powers, the wife of Jonathan Rideout. And it was an old slate stone. It was an early stone. So I asked my mother, my father had passed away, so I asked my mother if she knew anything about it. How did it get in the dirt at this building site? And she had in her memory that there was an old burial ground across the street from Ranger Road, where our house was in Hollis, and Pine Hill Road and Howe Lane. And she said she remembered that there were maybe a few stones in the woods from this old burial ground, and that perhaps one of my father's brothers had picked this stone up and moved it down onto their farm and just laid it down beside the old schoolhouse. So we picked it up and we moved it over to the schoolhouse that we've since restored, and it's in the basement of the schoolhouse. And we're saving it. We're going to just have it mounted on the wall there so that people can see it. But it's Rebecca's stone, original stone. So then I came here to Pine Hill Cemetery, and I look at this monument behind me, and it has Rebecca's name on it. So obviously, her stone was replaced with a newer monument, a granite monument. So here we are at the monument of Jonathan Rideout, who married Rebecca Powers. And this is obviously a newer monument than an old slate stone, which we just looked at previously, the Bridget Powers and the Jonathan Powers and Susanna Willoughby stones. So Rebecca marries Jonathan Rideout, and they have a number of children: Jonathan, Jesse, Louisa, Norman, Elmira, Nathaniel, and Mahitable. 2 are buried here, Jonathan and Nathaniel, and several of the other children are buried just a ways over on the other side of the cemetery here, so we'll go look at them. So here we are over by the Howe stones, the Howe section of the Pine Hill Cemetery. And I just mentioned the names of the children of Jonathan Rideout and Rebecca Powers Rideout. We mentioned 3 daughters, Louisa, Elmira, and Mahitable. Elmira ended up marrying our 3rd Nathaniel, young Nathaniel Howe. And Nathaniel's gravestone is now on the ground. Elmira's is next to his. And between them, they had 6 children, which we'll go through in a minute or two. But in the meantime, I wanted to just connect Elmira with her 2 sisters. Her sister Louisa is named on this tall monument behind us. And she had a son, Pearlie. She was married to Francis Jewett. And their son, Pearlie Jewett, was in the Civil War, and he lost his life in the Civil War. He's buried there. They brought his body back after he was killed. And Sister Mehitable is to the right of Louisa, and she is on a stone marked next to William Hale. She was married either 2 or 3 times to a Blood, a Hale, and possibly a Wright. And then we'll come back to Elmira and Nathaniel, and they had 6 children. And the oldest one was Elizabeth. She was born in 1833. The next one in that family was William Edward Fetty Place Howe. He was born in 1835. The third child was John Prentice Howe, born in 1837. He married Olive Farwell. The fourth one was Norman Rideout. This is his stone. He was born in 1839, and he died in the Civil War in 1862. So these are 2 cousins. Pearlie Jewett and Norman Rideout were first cousins. Both went to the war and lost their lives. The fifth child was Lucy Ann, sometimes known as Annie L. She was married or not twice. Her name was initially Lucy Ann Bird, later Copeland, although we're not sure if she was actually married to Copeland. I'm not sure. And the youngest daughter was Ellen, and she's buried here. She was born in 1845, and she died in 1861. So in this family, Elmira died, her son Norman died, their daughter Ellen died, and their daughter Elizabeth died, all within 4 years during the Civil War. So it was a time of great tragedy for the family. So here we are at the gravestone of William Edward Fetty Place Howe. His father, young Nathaniel Howe Fetty Place Howe, named his firstborn son William after his youngest brother that he had been separated from at a young age. So this is William Edward Fetty Place Howe. He was born in 1835, and Honey Glover has a